Okay, guys, so this is a compilation of all the tips and tricks of the hardest areas that you guys have kind of indicated throughout this revision time. There's a few little things in here, so it's worth a listen, even though I think it's probably going to be a pretty long explain everything, but I will do my best to keep it short. Okay, just as an FYI, know your command terms. They are outlined here, and it's really important that you know what each of these mean, okay? One of the biggest things I find, and you will find, in the exam is that there are going to be questions that you don't know how to answer. So when you get to that point, what you can do is you can get out a highlighter and you can highlight two things for me. You can highlight the content term and the command term. And then by looking at the content and the command term, you should be able to figure out kind of what the question is asking. And it's better than getting 0 marks, okay? So make sure you know your command terms. So our first unit obviously is stress and the nervous system. So unit 3, area of study 1. Okay, so the first structure that I want you to make sure you know down pat is the spinal reflex process. Now, the spinal reflex obviously involves the interaction between sensory, inter, and motor neurons, and it allows a faster reaction time to protect your body from damage, okay? So when you talk about this, you must make sure you are talking about your sensory neurons carrying the sensory message of pain along a sensory pathway to the spinal cord, interneurons in the spinal cord, the motor neurons carrying out the motor message, which allows the withdrawal reflex. And while that spinal reflex is occurring, the sensory neurons will carry the pain message up to the brain, and the message is then received in the brain, okay? So make sure you're talking about the arc first. So it goes around to the spinal cord, and then the reflex occurs, and simultaneously that sensory information will go up to the brain where you receive the information of pain. Remember, this is an adaptive response. It allows for faster reaction time, okay? The other things that occur within this little dot point is the difference between a conscious and an unconscious response. Remembering a spinal reflex is both an unconscious response, i.e., withdrawing from the pain stimuli without thought or automatically, and then a conscious response. So you then become conscious of that pain afterwards. Make sure you know the difference between a conscious and unconscious response as well, okay? An area that tends to cause some confusion with you guys is Parkinson's disease. That's because there's, I guess, a lot of information and you don't quite know what to focus on. All you're focusing on is the degeneration of the neurons in the substantia nigra, so the part of the brain that has a role in voluntary motor movement, particularly those muscle movements being coordinated in a smooth and coordinated manner. And so we're just talking about what happens when those neurons die and when there is a lower level of dopamine in the body, okay? So primarily you're looking at what happens when there's low levels of dopamine, how does that affect symptoms of Parkinson's, and how do we overcome that with treatments like L-DOPA, okay? So here's a question that you can look at. People with Parkinson's disease usually experience interference in neurotransmitter functions, so dopamine, don't worry about GABA. Explain the relationship between neurotransmitter imbalances and two chronic changes in motor functions experienced when suffering from Parkinson's disease. Now, a few things to think about here. Make sure you know what happens when dopamine is lowered for those who have Parkinson's disease. Make sure you know how to treat people with Parkinson's disease. So we're going to use a dopamine agonist, so something that mimics dopamine, and know motor and non-motor symptoms of Parkinson's disease, and know how the motor symptoms link with those low levels of dopamine, and how the non-motor symptoms can link with the motor symptoms. Excuse me. So this is how we might answer the question. So you've got 1 mark for saying that less dopamine is produced. Now we know that dopamine is produced in the substantia nigra in the midbrain, okay? And so this affects areas in the brain, more specifically the substantia nigra, involved in voluntary muscle movement. And so this results in neurons firing uncontrollably so people can't control their voluntary motor movements. This leads to the chronic motor changes, okay? So we have tremors, muscle rigidity, slowness of voluntary of voluntary movement and postural instability, okay? It's not enough just to name those changes or those symptoms. You have to make sure that you describe them as well. Now, the next area that we're looking at is the general adaptation syndrome, including the fight, flight, freeze response and the role of cortisol. So, Hans Selye, he looked at, excuse me, the physiological stress response in rats when they were stressed, okay? So he pretty much stressed out a whole bunch of rats and then they carked it, and he kind of wanted to see why. And so he kind of like coined stress as like this non-specific response to stresses. And we know that physiological, it is non-specific, but we know that it can also be influenced by different psychological appraisals, okay? So pretty much what he thought was that stress, or the physiological nature of stress, follows this particular pattern and that we can see in this diagram. You need to make sure that you can draw this diagram, okay? So you need to make sure that you know the 3 stages, so alarm stage, resistance, and exhaustion, and you know the 2 substages, shock and counter shock. You need to make sure that you know the pattern of the curve and where the curve falls below or above the line of resistance, okay? So, when you're responding to each stage, you need to make sure that you know where the line of resistance falls and why that might occur biologically, okay? So when we first, excuse me, when we first receive bad news or we assess a stressor, we might go into shock. And so we can see that the line of resistance, or that we fall below the line of resistance. So our body acts like it's injured, and that's where we might have a heart attack or we might faint. Now, when the body realizes it needs to overcome the stressor, then we mobilize our resources and we begin to cope much better. So we're coping and we are able to cope, and that's above the line of resistance. So that's because our fight-flight response is initiated by the sympathetic nervous system, and adrenaline as well as cortisol is released, okay? Now, initially, adrenaline is, well, they're both released at the same time, but adrenaline is really the thing that kickstarts your organs, okay? And that will allow you to have a really fast response to the stressor, but it dissipates very, very quickly, okay? And that's when cortisol comes in. So in resistance, we are coping, okay? So we're doing everything that we should, and that's because we have the secretion of cortisol in our system. Now, we know that cortisol is helpful in the short term because it energizes our body. It helps to repair our body from damage. But prolonged exposure to the stressor can actually increase our susceptibility to illness because it compromises our immune system. So we tend to be okay, but then as cortisol begins to be prolonged, we can see that our resistance to stress begins to dip below the line of resistance, or it begins to go down. Now, in resistance, or in exhaustion, I should say, our resistance to the stressor is well below the normal, well below the normal, or well below the norm, and we are incredibly susceptible to illness. Now, people often ask, how do I tell the difference between resistance and exhaustion? If you are still coping, you can still do all the things that you normally do, even if maybe you have inhibited function to a degree, then you're probably still in resistance. If you can no longer function, or if the illness that you have lingers on and on and on, then you're probably in exhaustion, okay? So let's have a go at this question. One week remained before close exams. She stayed up late every night studying, and although she was feeling tired, she seemed to be managing her workload. 2 nights before her first exam, she witnessed her dog being hit by a car, which upset her very much. On the morning of her exam, she woke up with a headache, a sore throat, and she kept sneezing. So, which stage is she going to be most likely when she wakes up with a headache? And explain why an illness such as a sore throat is experienced by Chloe during this stage of gas. So she is in resistance, okay? Excuse me. She's in resistance because she can function relatively well. She can probably still go to school and do her exam. For B. So stress hormones remain at a high level for a long period of time to overcome the stressor. Make sure that you always tell the examiner what the stressor is. Always apply to the scenario. So the strength of the immune system is reduced because it's suppressed by stress hormones, and this makes Tasha more susceptible to illness such as colds. Okay, so make sure that you're always applying to the scenario, and don't forget to know the strengths and limitations of this model, the difference between adrenaline and cortisol, and the difference between the fight, flight, and freeze responses. Okay, particularly the fight, flight, and the freeze response, because there is a difference interaction between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system in those two responses. So the next area that you've indicated that you've struggled with is Lazarus's model of stress and coping. So this is the model that interacts with gas. So pretty much, like, if we perceive there to be a stressor, that's when your fight, flight, freeze response or gas will initiate. Okay, so the physiological response will not initiate if you do not appraise something as stressful. So we know that stress is subjective. So what that means is, excuse me, we might all experience the same stressor, but we might all appraise it differently. So when you go into the exam on Thursday, which is not very far away, some of you might appraise it as a challenge. Some of you might appraise it as a threat. Your teachers might appraise it as not stressful because we're not the ones sitting the exam. So the stress response depends on the individual's interpretation of the stressor and their ability to cope with it, okay? So pretty much, like, almost instantaneously go, okay, is this stressful? Do I have the resources to cope? And if holistically the answer is no, I don't have the resources to cope, that's when your gas model kind of starts, okay? Now, if you, throughout the gas model, perceive that threat to be overcome or not really a stressor anymore, a threat or a challenge anymore, that's when the gas model will kind of like shut itself off. But if that stressor is prolonged, that's kind of why it keeps going into resistance and exhaustion stages. So we have two stages. We have the primary appraisal and the secondary appraisal. So in the primary appraisal, we appraise something as stressful, neutral, or irrelevant. If we appraise it as stressful, we need to know what type of stress it is. Is it harm loss? So has something been lost? Is it threat, which is future harm loss? Is there a challenge, an opportunity for growth? In the secondary appraisal, which occurs almost instantaneously after the primary appraisal, the person looks at what kinds of resources they have to deal with a stressor. So they look at their internal resources and their external resources. If they have enough resources to deal with a stressor, then they tend to experience eustress. If they don't have enough resources to deal with a stressor, then they tend to have distress. Okay. The secondary appraisal will only ever occur if someone addresses or appraises something as stressful. So if it's neutral or irrelevant, it will not go into the secondary appraisal. So let's have a look at this question here. Maddie, a university student, has become stressed when she lost her part-time job. With reference to Lazarus and Folkman's transactional model of stress and coping, describe two different primary appraisals that Maddie might have made when she became stressed. And then describe two approach strategies that Maddie could use to reduce her stress. So, Maddie could have found the stress a threat, harm, loss, or harm loss. Okay. Now, when you're doing this, what you need to do is you need to make sure that you're identifying it as stressful and the type of stress. You're using keywords and you're applying to the scenario. So if she perceives it as a threat, you need to say, Maddie is perceiving it as a threat because there is the future harm. In future, she might not be able to go to university. Okay. If she appraises it as a challenge, there is an opportunity for Maddie to gain something. What could you gain? Whatever it is, okay? In terms of B, there are a few different alternatives that you might use. But make sure you're looking at suggestions that are actually approaching or directly dealing with the stressor, okay? So things like exercise or meditation or things that deal with the emotions behind it may not be the best options to use, okay? Okay, so context-specific effectiveness, coping flexibility, and the use of particular strategies. I've seen lots of questions about exercise, approach, and avoidance strategies, but I haven't seen that much about context-specific effectiveness and coping flexibility. That makes me a little bit nervous, so just make sure that you know what these things are, okay? And make sure you can apply them to a scenario. So context-specific effectiveness is whether there's a good match between the coping strategy that is used and the stressful situation, okay? So like if you're stressed about your exams and the way that you're managing that stress is you're just playing video games, you probably don't have good context-specific effectiveness because your coping strategy isn't actually dealing, or it's not an approach strategy to deal with the stressful situation. Coping flexibility is the ability to effectively modify or adjust one's coping strategies according to the demands of the different stressful situations. So if you are dealing with a situation in a particular way, you're using a particular coping mechanism and it's not being effective, if you can recognize that it's not effective and then change it to something that's more effective, then you have good coping flexibility, okay? Now with all of these, make sure you know how to define and apply, more particularly when you're talking about exercise, approach, and avoidance strategies. Know what they are, know how they help, and know the strengths and limitations for the approach and avoidance strategies. All right, let's have a look at this question here. Explain how coping flexibility can influence context-specific effectiveness of coping. Very wordy, okay? How could we go about answering that question? Let's have a look. So for 1 mark, we are just defining context-specific effectiveness. So when there's a match or a good fit between the coping strategy that's used in the stressful situation. Coping flexibility influences context-specific effectiveness in a positive way. So if we have flexibility with coping and adjusting one's coping style, this helps to ensure that it's suitable for dealing with a specific stressful situation, okay? So essentially, if we have coping flexibility, it means that it only can improve our context-specific effectiveness. If we can recognize a strategy is not good for a stressor, then that will only improve that match or that good fit between the stressor and the strategy. Okay, and now we are into Unit 3, Area of Study 2. Now this has got quite a lot of information in it, and I've not by any means talked about most of it, so you need to make sure you're going through these things with a fine-tooth comb. Make sure you're looking at your dot points. Now, the first thing that I've not seen very much about is neurotransmitters and neurohormones. We know that the main neurotransmitter for learning is glutamate. So it's the main excitatory neurotransmitter throughout the brain, and it enhances information transmission by making the postsynaptic neuron more likely to fire. Okay. Now, when glutamate is repeatedly activated, in the postsynaptic neuron, it produces long-lasting changes, okay? So these structural changes or synaptogenesis means that the neural pathway is strengthened and the communication between neurons occurs more effectively, which essentially is your long-term potentiation. The neural hormone that we're talking about is adrenaline. We know that adrenaline has a role in initiating the fight-flight response, but it also initiates or induces the release of noradrenaline in the amygdala. So what noradrenaline does is it activates the amygdala to signal to the hippocampus that the details of an emotional experience are significant and long-term storage should be strengthened, okay? And so that's how emotional memories are consolidated, and that's why when you think about something that's particularly happy or particularly sad, you might feel those feelings of happiness or sadness, but the explicit or the declarative parts of that memory are very, very clear because of the interaction between the amygdala and the hippocampus. So I'm finding that people are still getting confused between long-term potentiation and long-term depression, okay? Now, one is the strengthening of neural connections and one is the weakening. When we look at questions, just make sure you're doing 3 things. You're talking about the biological basis, you're talking about that something is being learned or forgotten, and the third thing is to apply to the scenario. And you can see how I've done this in this question, okay? So Corey has spent time with pro snowboarders to perfect his turns. At the end of the holidays, he went away to a snowboarding trip with his mates to Mount Buller. He was traveling very fast and he flipped and hit his head and he was unconscious. So explain the role of LTD and LTP in enabling Corey to perfect his turns. So LTD weakens the connections between the neurons, okay? And so that will mean that he will forget how to, that will forget the memories associated with the incorrect way that he used to turn. LTP, on the other hand, will strengthen the connections between the neurons, and that will mean a memory will be formed, and he will learn how to learn he will learn how to do the new turns that he needs to learn. Okay, I know that this is an area that is very contentious for a lot of you as well, okay? Now just make sure that you know the structures, their roles, and what happens when they are damaged. The other thing that you should have an idea of is HM's case study, okay? So remember, he had epilepsy, and so they removed his hippocampus, okay? So you might want to just brush up on his case study. So we have 4 areas of the brain, and you need to know what their roles are, but you need to know how they also interact. So the hippocampus is this seahorse-shaped thing. It's the thing that's blue. It consolidates, encodes, and retrieves explicit long-term memories, and it also transfers new memories to relevant parts of the brain for permanent storage. Okay, it does not store memories. So this is linked with the cerebral cortex, and the cerebral cortex just stores explicit memories, okay? Now it stores those memories in the modalities that they've been encoded in. So if it's visual, it will be stored in the back of the brain in the visual cortex. If it's auditory, it will be stored to the sides of the brain in the auditory cortex. The amygdala has a role in consolidation, formation, and the retrieval of emotional memories, particularly those to do with fear and aggression, as well as classical conditioned memories, okay? So they are obviously generally memories to do with like fear and aggression, as well as maybe happiness as well. So just make sure we're not talking about storing, because the cerebral cortex actually also stores, we think, the emotional memories made by the amygdala. The cerebellum is involved in the encoding and temporary storage of implicit procedural memories, okay? Now, we're not talking about emotions here. We're talking about things to do with reflexes, okay? So the things that have to do specifically with explicit memories are your hippocampus and your cerebral cortex. The amygdala and the cerebellum have a role in your implicit memories. So let's have a look at this question here. Describe the interaction of 2 brain areas involved in the formation and storage of memories of your 16th birthday. 5 marks. So you get 2 marks for naming 2 brain structures, and then 2 marks for explaining the role of each, and then 1 mark is the interaction. So the hippocampus is involved in the consolidation or formation of the explicit long-term memory of the birthday party. Make sure you apply. The amygdala is involved in the formation of the emotional memory. Happiness, maybe, always apply. The cerebral cortex is involved in storing explicit memories. Apply. What are the explicit memories? So you need to make sure that you explain how they interact. So for example, the hippocampus transfers memories to the cerebral cortex for storage, or the amygdala activates the hippocampus to form explicit memories of the event. Make sure, I know I've said this about 7 million times, apply to the goddamn scenario for God's sakes, okay? If you just talk through the theory, you're not going to get that many marks, okay? Make sure that you know how each of these brain areas interact with each other. And make sure you know the difference between implicit and explicit memories, okay? Implicit are ones that are unconscious. That's why it's hard to explain what fear feels like, or it's hard to explain what a procedural memory is, okay? Explicit memories are things that we can consciously recall, okay? So things like your 16th birthday party, or things like what the role of the cerebral cortex is. Okay, damage to the brain. When we talk about damage to the brain, we're talking about things like Alzheimer's disease, which is a neurodegenerative disease, very similar to Parkinson's, but there are differences. Amnesia, and amnesia kind of comes about through brain trauma, as well as neurodegenerative diseases, as well as surgery. So amnesia is a permanent, temporary, complete, partial loss of memory, typically as a result of an organic cause, okay? So things like Alzheimer's, so on and so forth. The only one that you need to know is anterograde amnesia, okay? And so what that means is if you look at the image, there's an event, it might be an accident, a stroke, surgery, whatever. And so anterograde amnesia means there's an inability to encode and store new long-term memories after the event. This is because the hippocampus has been damaged, so the person is unable to consolidate new long-term declarative memories, okay? What this does not mean is the person cannot store emotional memories, because in this case the amygdala has not been damaged. One cause of amnesia is Alzheimer's disease. Now, this is very, very, very biologically based, okay? It would be really good if you know the similarities and differences between Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And this is a neurodegenerative disease characterized by the progressive widespread deterioration of brain neurons, causing memory loss, declining cognitive skills, and personality changes. So in this disorder, both anterograde and retrograde amnesia occurs. So they cannot encode and store new memories, and they also lose memories that have already been encoded, stored, okay? And that's because neurons in the brain die progressively. We need to know that memory loss in the later stages includes severe declines in both implicit and explicit memories, and there's actually a pattern of forgetting which I'll talk you through in a little bit. You need to primarily know the causes and the symptoms. The causes and the symptoms are not the same thing. When I say cause, I want the biological basis. When I say symptoms, what I want is what's going on with their memories, okay? One causes the other. So what are our causes? First off, the brain atrophies. So neurons become damaged and they die, okay? Now that happens, or it starts at the hippocampus, and then it goes out to the side, and then it goes from the frontal lobe around to the back. The last thing to die is the brainstem, and that's when the person tends to die, because the brainstem has a role in keeping autonomic function active, or the body alive. The reason why the brain atrophies is amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. It would be good to know the similarities and differences between those two things. So amyloid plaques are sticky clusters of protein fragments forming in between the synapse, and so they stop transmission. Neurofibrillary tangles, they are a buildup of protein fibers within the neurons, and they cause cell death. Now, because there is a lack of neurons, the brain actually lacks acetylcholine, which is an important memory neurotransmitter. So you need to know how these things affect memories and their progressive deterioration in the brain, okay? So let's have a go at this question. James' grandfather is 85 years old and his doctor has advised the family he has Alzheimer's. As a psychology student, what could James say to A, inform his family about the likely progression of symptoms of the disease, and B, help his grandfather slow the progress of the disease? Okay, so A, the deterioration of memory systems is progressive. So it would be good for you to talk about the difference between early and later symptoms. But realistically, you only need to give one symptom of each, okay? For B, what we're looking at really is a crossover question. So one way to help slow down Alzheimer's or the progression of Alzheimer's is to keep plasticity at a high level. So brain activity should be as varied as possible, so using puzzles, games, and learning new information. Just make sure that when you are looking at Alzheimer's, you know that we can only actually diagnose Alzheimer's through autopsy. That has definitely popped up before, and it will pop up again. And as I recall, the state did really poorly on that particular multiple choice question. There is a big difference between symptoms and causes. Make sure you know early versus late symptoms. Make sure how the cause affects the brain and memories. And it's also good just to know comparisons between normal and abnormal decline of memories, that is. Okay, I think you guys are getting better at this question actually. So this is memory reconstruction to do with leading questions and Loftus's research. Just another good research study to make sure that you know. This was an extended response a while ago. It probably won't be an extended response again, but it would be a really good question to analyze in terms of experimental design and things like that, okay? So Loftus found that in the presence of leading questions, memory can be reconstructed, okay? Now that's because we know that memory is really active, and so when it's consolidated and then reconsolidated, new information kind of comes in. And so inaccurate bits and pieces of information about an event, like a leading question, something different that someone else has said about the event, is integrated into the existing long-term memory, and it's consolidated as part of the original experience. Now, when that memory is reconstructed or retrieved, then the person doesn't know what is real and what's false, and the memory becomes distorted. Let's have a go at this. Jeffrey was in a serious car accident, although he was not injured. In the days following the accident, he could not help thinking about it over and over again. 6 weeks later, he drives to the intersection where the accident occurred and he feels anxious. He also experiences vivid flashbacks of the accident. 6 witnesses were at the scene where Jeffrey was involved in the car accident. 3 of them were asked questions that contained accurate information about the scene, and 3 of them were asked questions that had misleading or false information. According to Loftus and Palmer, which of the witnesses would provide a fallible testimony of the car accident and why? Alright, so a couple of things. Memories can be reconstructed not just through leading questions, okay? If you revisit information from the past again and again, information can be integrated through other means that are not leading questions. So like if I'm feeling a certain way, like if I'm feeling stressed about something and I'm thinking about, or if I've retrieved a memory about a birthday party, when I reconsolidate that, it might also reintegrate my feelings of stress into that event. So next time I think about it, I might not think about that memory in a particularly pleasant way, because last time I was stressed when I was thinking about it, okay? So just keep in mind that like even if you just think about a memory over and over and over again, just by doing that, that can actually still distort the memory, okay? Anyway, let's have a look at this answer. Okay, so just one thing. If the question says, according to Loftus and Palmer, according to Loftus, you have to make sure you say something like, according to Loftus, memories can be reconstructed and they can be affected by leading questions. So make sure you reference Loftus's research. If the question doesn't talk about Loftus or it doesn't mention her by name, you don't need to do that, okay? So for this question here, for 1 mark, the witnesses who were asked leading questions would have an inaccurate memory, okay? So when we say fallible, it means that they are prone to distortion or inaccuracy. They would be more likely to integrate false information from the leading questions, and you should always give an example of a leading question, into their existing long-term memory of the accident. And therefore, when they reconstructed the memory, it would be inaccurate or fallible, okay? So make sure you're applying to the scenario. What is the leading question? What actually happened? I've already talked about the idea that memories can be distorted by factors other than leading questions. Make sure you know the difference between a leading question and a non-leading question. You might get questions asking how a leading question, or like for you to come up with a leading question, and how that might mess with someone's memory. So the only learning stuff I'm going to do with you is operant conditioning. You guys are pretty good at this and you're improving, but people are still getting a little bit confused. Just remember that when we're talking about both classical conditioning and operant conditioning, you need to make sure you're applying it to the 3-phase model. So with classical conditioning, we're talking about before conditioning, during conditioning, and after conditioning. Sorry, my phone went off and I actually have no idea what I was even saying. Anyway, so I'm just going to continue on. So I think I was talking about the 3-phase model. So classical conditioning before, during, and after conditioning. And with the DBC or operant conditioning, we're talking about the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence, okay? I always find it's easy to figure out what the behavior and the consequence is before the antecedent, but make sure whenever you're talking about operant conditioning, you're giving me the A, B, C, as well as what the consequence actually is. So is it positive reinforcement? Is it negative reinforcement? Make sure you fully define and apply to the scenario. So let's have a go at this one. Miss Warren is trying to teach her noisy Year 7 class to put up their hands when they have a question, rather than calling out. Her strategy involves giving encouragement and praise to students when they do the correct behaviour and ignoring any questions that are called out. After several weeks, she finds that all students are raising their hands and the calling out behaviour has stopped. So what type of learning are they using to justify a response? And define the term stimulus discrimination. Describe how the students could display stimulus discrimination in this situation. All right, so first one, they're using operant conditioning. The reason it's operant conditioning is the behaviour is voluntary and the kids are active in their learning, okay? If you ever get a question that's comparing operant and classical conditioning, just use one is voluntary, one is active, one is involuntary and passive, okay? One is complex, i.e. operant conditioning is complex, whereas classical conditioning is simple, okay? So it's not strictly study design, but it's good for you to know anyway. The other thing that you really need to know, and I spoke about this when I went through the 217 VCAR exam, was you need to make sure you know the processes for classical and operant conditioning. So when I say processes, I mean things like stimulus discrimination, stimulus generalization, and all that jazz, okay? They are different for both classical and operant conditioning, so make sure you know the differences, please, because that would be a really bad question to stuff up on a big question. So stimulus discrimination occurs when an organism produces a response only in response to the original situation when reinforcement occurs, not in a similar situation. So the class will only put up their hands for Miss Warren and not for any other teacher. Make sure you give me the elements. So what's the B, what's the A, what's the C? So now we are on to Unit 4, Area 1, Area Study 1, SOC. Everyone's favourite. Okay, let's talk about the characteristics of being in an ASC. So we have two states of consciousness. We have a NWC and an ASC. Okay, there are two ways that we can tell if we're in ASC. They are physiological measures and psychological measures. The things that you see on your screen are psychological measures. You need to make sure that you know what they look like in terms of an NWC versus an ASC, okay? You need to make sure that you can identify a characteristic, you can explain what it looks like in an ASC versus NWC, be explicit, and you need to make sure that you give some good examples. So what we want to see is a direction, okay? So like in time orientation, your ability to perceive time passing might be quicker or it might be slower than an NWC. And so then you need to give a good example, okay? Now, just have a structured response and make sure you know that structure for when you go into the exam, because it's easy just to use it for many different questions. Let's have a go at this question. It was Nicola's 21st birthday and she was out late celebrating with her friends. She came home around 4 a.m. and went straight to sleep. Her alarm woke her up at 7 a.m., but Nicola was not sure if she was still in an alcohol-induced state. Identify and explain two characteristics to indicate how Nicola's flatmate April would be able to determine if she was in a normal waking consciousness or in an altered state of consciousness. 4 marks. So you get 2 marks for identifying the scenario, and then, identifying a characteristic, and then you get another 2 marks for talking about the comparison between the NWC and ASC as well as application, okay? So just remember that this mark scheme's a little bit out, but just make sure that you're doing those 3 things: identify, explain or compare, and apply. So what you might use are things that are easy. So things like time orientation, cognitive distortions, and emotional awareness. Self-control, when you use it, talk about inhibitions rather than walking in a straight line or reaction time, because that's more physiological than psychological. So this is how you might structure your response. Time orientation. If Nicola was in an ASC, she might perceive time to be passing slower than if she was in an NWC. For example, she might put on the kettle to boil and think that it's been boiling for 3 seconds when it's been boiling for 10 minutes. So make sure you identify the characteristic, explain what's happening in terms of the characteristic. Don't just say more or less. Give me a proper direction and then give a good example. The other ways that you can tell if someone is in an ASC is by using physiological methods, or as well as other kinds of things. So we've got video monitoring, self-reports, measurements of speed and accuracy, and physiological measurements. These are divided into objective measures and subjective measures. And so it's really important that you know what each of these things are, what they measure, and strengths and limitations for each of them. Make sure you know why these strengths are good and why these limitations are bad. Realistically, it's just easy to talk about the fact that they are either subjective or objective, and you can take your strengths and limitations from there. Now, this would typically be looking we would typically look at these concepts in relation to things like sleep deprivation, being in a drug-induced state, okay, to do with brainwaves and things like that, as well as ASCs. So make sure you know this very well. So the physiological methods that are used to study consciousness are your electroencephalograph, EEG, electrooculograph, EOG, and electromyograph, EMG. Together, they are used in a polysomnogram, which is data collected simultaneously from all of these devices. You need to make sure that you know these definitions down pat. A lot of you are still not giving me the proper definitions. Remember DARE. Now, when we talk about electroencephalograph, make sure you're saying as measured by brainwaves. When we talk about electrooculograph, make sure you're saying in the muscles responsible for eye movement, okay? Make sure you're being specific. When we are talking about electroencephalograph, the EEG, make sure you know the associated brainwaves and so the frequency, the amplitude, and what states they are associated with. Know those quite well because they are a crossover area when we look at stimulants and depressants. So let's have a look at this question. You were conducting research in the sleep lab investigating how much time the average person spends in REM sleep. In order to detect whether a person is in REM sleep, you could use electrooculograph and electroencephalograph. Explain how each device may indicate the person is in REM sleep. So this is 4 marks. So you've got one for a definition and one for indicating how that person or what would happen if that person was in REM sleep. So as I've said, one for the definition, okay? So make sure you're using DARE. And then when we're talking about how it would detect you're in REM, make sure that you're first talking about the amount of electrical activity. So an EOG would detect a large amount of electrical activity because there is fast, jerky eye movement in REM sleep. So tell me what's going on with electrical activity and why that is. If we're looking at brainwaves, then I would identify and describe the brainwaves. So if a person is in REM, then they're going to look at or they're going to detect irregular beta-like waves with a sawtooth pattern. Okay, biological rhythms. The reason I thought I would put this in here is because a lot of you don't really, or you're not very familiar with a superchiasmic nucleus. And that's a really important process for you guys to know and understand because it could be used in lots of responses. So just remember that a circadian rhythm involves changes in the bodily functions or activities that occur as a part of a cycle with a duration of about 24 hours. So we've got our sleep-wake cycle, body temperature, secretion of melatonin and cortisol. So a circadian rhythm is endogenous, so it's based on that melatonin secretion, but it is influenced by light and things like that, so environmental time cues. It's regulated by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, I'm probably saying that wrong, within the hypothalamus, okay? Now what actually happens is when it's light outside, and this is something that you need to know the process, and I'm sorry this image isn't very good, but when it's light outside, sensors in the eyes send information to the suprachiasmatic nucleus within the hypothalamus, okay? Now, what that will do is that will signal to the pineal gland to secrete more or less melatonin. So when there's more light, it means that the melatonin will stop being produced. And if there's less light, more melatonin will be produced because melatonin induces sleepiness, okay? So just make sure that you use that process. If you're talking about things like bright light therapy or things like circadian rhythm disorders and things like that, if it's an extended response, that's a really nice way to bulk out your response and show the examiner some knowledge, if it works. So again, you need to know the difference between dysomnias and parasomnias. But you also need to know about circadian phase delay. Now, I'm not going to go through them, but I'm just going to remind you that there are 3 different circadian phase delays, and they are examples of dysomnias. So we have the shift in the adolescent sleep-wake cycle, we have shift work, and we have jet lag, okay? You need to make sure you know the descriptions, why they occur, and the effects on sleep. Now, these are really linked with that slide that I showed you previous, in so much as we're talking about the secretion of melatonin and the suprachiasmatic nucleus, okay? So make sure that you really brush up on these things. I've not seen any questions about this in any, or much in the exams, and I haven't seen any in the, obviously, the samples of the 2017 VCAR. So they could throw something wiggly at you for this, okay? Just make sure that when you're talking about these, you're talking about the biological component, so the secretion of melatonin, and then you're talking about how it actually affects them feeling tired or going to bed, okay? So just remember that we have 2 interventions for sleep disorders. We have CBT for insomnia and bright light therapy for circadian rhythm disorders, okay? CBT we know we can use for phobias and other things, and this is where we're using cognitive and behavioural methods to help people change unhelpful or unhealthy thought processes, feelings and behaviours, and we are changing them into ones that are more adaptive. So the therapist is helping to identify and replace unhelpful thoughts into ones that are more realistic, as well as teaching strategies to change or remove unhelpful behaviors and develop better ones, okay? So this is a really basic structure that you can use for any kind of response for CBT, although I've given you a better one when I've talked through phobias. So just make sure you're always defining, you're always giving me the theory, so identifying and replacing unhelpful thoughts or behaviors with ones that are more adaptive and helpful, and then you'll give me a really good strategy. So you're not just saying like sleep hygiene, for example. Tell me what that involves. Bright light therapy is for the circadian rhythm disorders, okay? So this involves timed exposure to intense but safe amounts of light. You need to know when they are being exposed to that bright light therapy and what that's going to do biologically. So it's going to stimulate the inhibition of melatonin, okay? Stimulate the inhibition. It's going to inhibit the secretion of melatonin, sorry. And so that means the melatonin secretion will be delayed to an appropriate time to make them feel sleepy at an appropriate time. So tell me what it is, when they're exposed to it, and when it makes them feel sleepy and why. So let's have a look at this question. Bright light therapy is often used to help treat shift work disorder. Explain what bright light therapy is and then suggest how it could be used to resynchronize the shift worker's sleep-wake cycle. 3 marks. Okay, very easy. So 1, tell me what it is. Give me the definition. 2, shift workers should be exposed in the evening before they start work. And 3, this is going to delay the release of melatonin, which induces sleep, to help to shift their sleep-wake cycle forward. So they're actually going to feel tired after they finish work, okay? So make sure that you know the structures for both CBT and bright light therapy, and make sure that you know when to expose each disorder to bright light therapy, okay, so as to properly resynchronize their sleep-wake cycle. Now, there is a slide on that in one of my revision lectures on SOC, so look at that when on my YouTube channel. And Unit 4, our last area of study 2. Okay, so let's start by looking at the mental health continuum. Just remember that mental health isn't concrete, and neither is an individual's placement on the continuum. So what that means is our mental health might shift over time in different situations. You need to make sure that you know how to differentiate between mental health problem, and mental illness, okay? Excuse me. When Vika is asking about someone being mentally healthy, we're looking at things like having social and emotional well-being, resilience, having a high level of functionality. When we're looking at mental illness, we're looking at dysfunction, atypical behavior, distress. When you look at these kinds of things in questions, you need to identify the characteristic like atypical behavior and then provide specific evidence from the scenario, okay? So where are they doing something that they didn't used to do or not doing something that they used to do? The thing that takes someone with a mental health problem to mental illness is really the timing, okay? So you can have a mental health problem and display distress, atypical behavior, and dysfunction. But if it's shorter than like 2 months, then they probably don't have a mental illness, and that's your yardstick. If we're mentally healthy, we need to maintain our mental health. So this is something that we can do by developing resilience. So resilience is the ability to cope with and adapt well with life stresses and restore positive functioning. It can be developed or learned, and so it doesn't remove stress, but it does enable us to cope better with stress so we can function more effectively. The way that we can do that is through biological factors, psychological factors, and social factors. Biological factors are diet and sleep. Social factors are obviously social support, and CBS or cognitive behavioral strategies are psychological. So these are all ways that we can maintain health. You need to make sure that you know how to identify, explain, and apply to a situation. So make sure you're really telling me like how adequate diet can really restore positive functioning or social support. Don't just say that like they have social support, so therefore they're less likely to develop a mental illness. Why is that? Explain that properly. So these are the causal factors in the development of phobias. These are different from the general risk and protective factors. So make sure you know generally what the BPS framework is: biological, psychological, social factors. Make sure you know what the 4 Ps are as well and how to differentiate between them, okay? These are also different from just those general risk factors, so I would encourage you to go over those again and make sure you know how to differentiate those from the ones to do with phobias, okay? I'm not going to go over this, okay, but make sure, no, I'm not going to go over this like very specifically, but I'm just going to remind you of the factors, okay, because there are ones that we see all the time and there are ones that we just don't see, okay, but make sure that you can directly link each contributing factor to how a mental disorder could develop, okay? So again, don't just like say classical conditioning, really explain to me how classical conditioning through the 3-phase model could lead to a phobia, for example. So we have biological dysfunctional GABA and stress response on long-term potentiation. We see GABA a lot, so you might want to look over the fight-flight response and LTP because I don't see that around a lot. For psychological, we've seen a lot of classical conditioning and operant conditioning, haven't seen a lot of cognitive bias, okay? So cognitive bias is a tendency to think in a way that involves errors of judgment and faulty decision making. We have 2, we've got memory bias, refers to knowledge, beliefs, and feelings distorting our memory of experiences, and catastrophic thinking, which occurs when an individual repeatedly overestimates the potential dangers of an object, okay? Haven't seen a lot of that. That could be something good that Vika could throw in, okay? That might stump you. For social, we have specific environmental trigger and stigma. Seen a little bit of stigma, but not very much of the specific environmental phobia. Specific environmental trigger. So that might be something that you want to look over. So in terms of common questions, we see a lot to do with classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So let's have a look at this one here. So this is a 9 marker. This is a good example of a 9 marker where you can break it down quite easily into the subsections and where you can use subheadings to help organize your response. So Warren has a phobia of water. When he was a small child, he went to the beach to go swimming. When he was in the water, he was caught by a rip and almost drowned. As an adult, Warren prefers to not go near large bodies of water, saying that it makes him feel too anxious. He even avoids taking baths as it reminds him of the drowning incident. Explain how classical and operant conditioning may contribute to the development and perpetuation of a specific phobia, with reference to an example demonstrating the influence of each learning process. So as we can see, we can really break this down into classical conditioning and operant conditioning, okay? Now, we know that classical conditioning precipitates a phobia. Always make sure that you say that. And we also want to talk about the three-phase model. So make sure you're breaking it down using the structure that you see here before, during, and after, okay? Make sure when you talk about classical conditioning, for all of you, always tell me what they are like scared in response to. A lot of you are just saying they are experiencing fear, but you need to tell me why. What are they actually scared? It might be a little bit of overcompensation, but it will help to really round out your explanation. Also, during conditioning, make sure you always apply to the scenario. A lot of you are still using just the theory, and you need to make sure you apply every step of the way. In terms of operant conditioning, we know that that perpetuates a phobia. Make sure you use your ABC and make sure you talk about negative reinforcement and how this occurs, okay? So remember, we're talking about we are avoiding something and that increases the likelihood of the behavior reoccurring. Always apply to the scenario. Now, in terms of evidence-based interventions for phobias, these are literally like just all of the interventions, okay? In terms of biological treatments, we see a lot on GABA agonists. We don't see a lot of breathing, retraining, and exercise, okay? So they might be good ones to look over. We know we've got systematic desensitization and CBT for psychological treatments. We've seen that a lot. And we know we've got psychoeducation for social treatment. We've seen that a few times, okay? But that structure is very similar to your CBT structure. Okay, let's have a look at this question. Anita has a phobia of birds after being attacked by an aggressive emu when she was visiting a zoo. With reference to the three-phase model of classical conditioning, outline how the process of systematic desensitization could be used to reduce Anita's fear of birds. Okay, so this is a structure that you need to make sure that you learn, okay? If I were you and you don't know how to write this structure, practice, 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 okay? So, just remember, with systematic desensitization, we are replacing an existing conditioned response, okay? So we're going to have 2 CSs and 2 CRs. So for 1 mark, you need to identify before, during, and after. Before conditioning, the birds, which is a CS, causes a fear response. And then the person is taught a relaxation technique, so breathing retraining or progressive muscle relaxation, which will elicit a relaxation response, okay? So the technique elicits the response, and the technique is a UCS. The patient creates a fear hierarchy, excuse me, and so you have to give examples of that fear hierarchy, okay? So give at least 2 or 3 examples. During conditioning, the patient is progressively, always say the word progressively, introduced to their fear hierarchy, so CS, while pairing with a relaxation technique, UCS. After conditioning, the CS will produce a relaxation response rather than a fear response, okay? Make sure that you are learning that technique down pat, okay? If you can get it, it's going to save you so much time and energy in the exam if you can just rip it out. The other structure that you need to know is for psychoeducation. Now, pretty much like the structure for this and CBT is exactly the same. 1, define. 2, talk about one aspect of a strategy, and 3, talk about the other aspect of a strategy. That kind of doesn't make sense, but this is what I mean. So the first mark for psychoeducation is to define it, okay? And so if it's an extended response, this is taken from a practice sack, I think. You might also want to talk about what the purpose is. So psychoeducation is to help or support the person deal with their phobia and to reduce stigma. So Then they're going to ask, then you can identify one, I suppose, strategy of psychoeducation, which is challenging unrealistic or anxious thoughts. Okay, so you need to identify that they're doing that and outline a specific strategy. Okay, so you need to make sure that you're applying to the scenario when you're doing this. The second thing is you are identifying not encouraging avoidant behaviors. Okay, so the first one is to do with thoughts. The second one is to do with behaviors, very similar to CBT. So again, you are outlining a strategy and you have to make sure you're applying to the scenario. Okay. In terms of the changing unrealistic thoughts, probably what you want to talk about is overestimating the dangers and underestimating her ability to cope. And so they're going to encourage her to find more realistic ways by talking her through her fears and making her realize that it's unlikely that grass, for example, is going to hurt her. In terms of not encouraging avoidance behaviors, they might help her to gradually expose herself to the fear stimulus and not criticize her behavior. Okay, so just make sure that you're applying to the scenario and you know the underlying theory. So in terms of this image, this is just how phobias, I suppose, fits in with the BPS framework as well as the 4Ps one, okay? This might help you to keep this straight in your mind. There is another one with the general risk and protective factors that you might want to look at as well, okay? And that is in my mental health explain everything. So lastly, just KISS areas to review. Just make sure that you're looking over these things here. It's just really important that you know your KISS skills well. And again, there's an explain everything for this. It's on GoTo in the KISS skills section. Just make sure that you know how to fix mistakes and things like that, okay? So look over these 3 areas here. The other thing I want you to look over is conclusions and generalizations, okay? When we are talking about results, trends, and things like that, just make sure that if you are looking at extend response and it is, I suppose, if it's a data analysis, you should always analyze at least 2 points of data in comparison to each other, okay? So just make sure you're knowing how to do that. Just look through these notes for me, okay? And if you have any questions, let me know, okay? Lastly, here are some abbreviations that you can use. And very last, here are some tips and tricks that you can look at before the exam day. Now, what I will do is I'm going to start sending you some emails just about the last things that you can do before exam revision. And then I'm going to send you a final email on Wednesday night to tell you to go to bed. Anyway, that is my explain everything. Again, I'm so sorry it was a little bit rushed and it wasn't the best I've ever done, given my throat is killing me. But I hope you got something out of it. And if you need any more help, please come and see me or let me know, okay? I cannot help you if you don't let me know that you need help.